Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinzler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Enjoying the long fall we've had.
You know, it's funny because I keep seeing, at least on Facebook, people that have posted pictures of 2019 even, that we had snow by this time. And
saw that.
Different things. And it's so interesting because it's really, here we are. It's what, the 11th
I've still got
today?
roses blooming.
I know. I still have daylilies I had a couple daylilies that are still popping up, and it's great.
Sometimes we have short weather memories. I don't, I should have remembered snow on 2019, but I don't.
Yeah.
Maybe it was a bad memory.
Well, and it probably was one of those things that just kind of came and maybe it was snow for a little bit and then just didn't last, you know?
Exactly.
But yeah, it's a nice fall. There's still plenty of time to get out in the yard and do some chores.
So I feel content. We've had a nice long fall. I like it.
Yeah, it's really good. Hey, Don, what's the best way to become a good gardener? I'm sure people ask you that all the time.
What's the best way to become a good gardener? I do not know.
Trial and error.
Definitely.
Well, I kind of wanted to use that joke today because, we're talking about trial and error. And in addition to that, the other good way of becoming a good gardener is to go to reliable sources like you yourself. You put out weekly great columns that have good advice for gardeners, and then people will write to you and you will respond to them. But also your source for knowledge comes from generational. You learned a lot from your mother, right?
Sure, exactly.
But then you brought a book today that has been a source of knowledge for you. So let's talk about this book that you brought in here today.
Oh, and I love gardening books. I get a lot of information online too, like a lot of us. But gardening books, I enjoy, I enjoy collecting those as well. But anyway, I've got a special gardening book that was given to me by my grandparents. Now, my mother's side of the family were from North Dakota. My dad's side were from New Jersey. And New Jersey, of course, their motto is the Garden State. And actually, my grandfather Kinzler dropped over dead in his vegetable garden. I mean, it's not funny, right. But, in my way of thinking, what a way to go.
Yeah.
And so anyway, they were wonderful gardeners. And they had a book that was kind of their Bible, their gardening Bible, because it had so much good information. It's called The Complete Book of Garden Magic. Complete Book of Gardening Magic. And so anyway, when they were quite elderly, they gave me that book. I suppose I was probably in high school. And by that time, I was really enjoying gardening. And so the book meant a lot to me because it had so much good information, things how to divide perennials, and it was so good. And so I valued that book highly. Well, in the flood of 97, I didn't have our books. I had an office in our garage, and I did not have our books high enough, and that garage was flooded, and I lost the book. It was just a totally muddy, soggy mess. And so anyway, I did throw it. Well, I missed that book so much that quite a number of years later, maybe 20 years later, I still wanted that book. And so I found it on eBay. And so I bought it. And so now I have that copy again. And it was written in 1935 originally, okay. And so it's going on 90 years old.
Yeah.
But the thing that I enjoyed looking at it again, once I had it in my hands again, was how that gardening information was still so relevant. And so sometimes this old gardening information, and sometimes I talk about the wisdom of old gardeners,
right.
Because there are some tried and true things that they don't change with the generations. It's good basic information. And so it's kind of fun to pass along. It was written by a man by the name of Roy E. Biles. And I don't know who he is, but in the preface to the book, he says that he's an amateur gardener. He had been gardening for 25 years and decided to kind of write down the things that he said. But anyway, it's kind of, I kind of get a kick out of the preface of the book. He says, the writer has made about every mistake that the poorest gardener can make or conceive, and therefore I know just how it feels. And he says that there's considerable repetition in the book because he doesn't want you to have to go back and forth looking at a previous chapter. So he says he knows your gardeners are in a hurry, and he wants you to find the directions right there. So he doesn't have you go back and forth within the book. So anyway, here's another thing that I found interesting. He said, it's a fact that the authorities are often not the best source for beginner gardeners, or even the average gardener to go to for advice, because their information is liable to be too brief. They take too much for granted and cannot get the common man's viewpoint. Then, too, they just don't know the answers to many questions that those of us common gardeners have.
Wow.
The reason is simple. The man who does his work perfectly and makes no mistakes, therefore, doesn't know how to advise those of us that do make mistakes.
Good point.
Yeah. The duffer who has blundered and found a way out can tell others how to correct or avoid those mistakes. So anyway, what I get a big kick out of is I always say I'm the perfect one to be talking gardening because I've made just about every mistake that anybody could possibly make. But what I enjoy about his comments and about the writings in the book, you can tell they're from someone who has actually gardened.
Yeah.
They're just not talking about something that's kind of theoretical, but he's talking from actual experience. And one of my good mentors, Neil Holland, professor and owner of Cheyenne Gardens, who passed away a number of years ago. But anyway, he always said to grow it is to know it, and experience is the best teacher. And so anyway, although the author of the book, I guess, is kind of maybe knocking, I suppose, horticulture professors or someone, I'm not sure who he's referring to, but he's mentioning the importance of actually growing it and the experience in that. And so from that aspect, the book is so practical. And many of us gardeners, that's what we're looking for, is practical information that is actually going to work. And so I'm so happy to have the book again. And it's going to be fun to kind of discuss some of the things that the book presents, some of the knowledge that it presents. And so from that aspect, I really have enjoyed this book for many, many years. I'm glad to have it back again.
Yeah, and just looking at the book now, I mean, it's very old, obviously, like you're saying. It's about 90 years old. It's kind of tattered. The spine's beat up. It's kind of, it'll be falling apart soon, so we're going to have to be really careful with it. But it's also really interesting, like some of the designs, the layout, illustrations on trees and tree roots. You just open to a page there. It's a really fascinating look at, again, something that's significantly older, but still has really relevant information, timely, a lot of, not timely, I should say, but timeless information is really what I meant to say.
Yeah, in fact, I just opened a page to the proper way to shape a hedge and trim a hedge. For example, the current recommendation is when you trim a hedge, a formal row of a hedge, is to make sure that the base is wider. So you trim it in kind of a pyramidal shape, flat-topped pyramid, so that the base will catch sunlight and it won't get leggy. Well, there's the line drawing of how to do, and look at that is the way that today it's recommended.
Yeah.
If you go to the University of Minnesota, their huge hedge collection, you'll see all of them trimmed just like that he was advocating 90 years ago.
Yeah, this will be really fun to kind of, you've kind of pulled out a couple of passages, a couple of pearls of wisdom that we're going to kind of go over. And so why don't you go first?
Sure. Okay. Here's a quote from the book. And I think we can all relate to this one. At least I know I can. Okay. In locating shrubs in a border, try to remember that they will grow to considerable size in a few years. Plant them at the proper distance apart, and then fill in between with temporary plantings that can be removed when the permanent plants reach larger size. And of course, we've all been guilty of, those plants when you go to buy a shrub, they're so cute when they're small, and we end up planting them too close and not giving them space, and then we need to deal with it. So he's got a good way of saying, remember, they'll grow to considerable size. And and I like the idea of planting something temporary in between.
Yep.
Maybe it's annual flowers, maybe it's pots of plants. And
or some other kind of object. Yeah, maybe it doesn't even have to be a plant, but maybe you use something else there. Yeah, like you said, a planter or something else there that could be kind of interesting too.
Yeah, so all of us are still very much aware that we need to give them space like that.
Well, space and time. I think that's the one thing that I fall guilty of, is not having enough patience with how fast something is growing, or how slow rather I perceive something is growing. And so you pack things in there, and then you have to deal with the fact that they're crowded and they may be overlapping each other. So yeah, that's a very good one that to start with. I've got one here. If the architecture of the house is good, it is a shame to screen it from the street with too much shrubbery. If the house doesn't look good and it would cost too much to remodel the exterior, then tree planting may be used to screen it. I both I like the verbiage though. The way it's written is kind of like of a time too.
It is, yeah.
But I think it's also, again, it's good information, that if you want to use something to kind of, now we would call it maybe sprucing up the outside of the house, a curb appeal, things like that. Yeah, to use some shrubbery. And then if your house does have, if there is it's a handsome house, you probably wouldn't want to do as much. You wouldn't want to have tall dogwoods or something in front of it.
Exactly. And when I give a program on ways to improve a home landscape or to create a good landscape from the onset, one thing I always mention is keep the trees off to the sides. And when I do a slide program, I show the opposite of beautiful homes, but they've got these maybe poorly placed trees that are screening this beautiful house. And so you kind of have the urge to try to peek through to see, boy, that house looks beautiful, but I can't see it. And so for many, the object of a good landscape is so that you can see the house, so that the landscape complements the house instead of all of a sudden hiding it behind something. And so anyway, I think his point is well taken that, if you want your house to look welcoming, maybe don't hide it behind something else.
Yeah, behind something so big as a tree, and something so permanent too.
Yeah, exactly.
That you're, again, going back to talking about plants that can be temporary. Well, a tree is, you don't want a tree to be temporary. That's a big investment, and it's just it's not good for the tree.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we're going to take a quick little break, and when we come back, we're going to have more little bits from this book. What's it called again? It is called,
let me get the title accurate here. It's called The Complete Book of Garden Magic by Roy G. Biles.
All right, more from that when we come back.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
Okay, we're back. We're talking with Don's personal kind of gardening Bible. Is the family Bible for gardeners in his family, and we're going over this. This is a book that's coming up on 90 years old, but still has such relevant information. And this part that we're coming to is something that we've been talking about kind of all summer, isn't it?
It is, and so it's fun to see it written about 90 years ago. And so here's a couple of lawn-type quotes from the book. To do a lawn any good, water should penetrate 4 inches or more. Light sprinklings do more harm than good. They are about the worst treatment you can give your lawn. Because we talked about, shallow waterings give shallow roots.
Yep.
None of us want to be shallow. So
Yeah.
we talked about applying enough at one point so that it's going to soak down in. That leads to the next quote. Data compiled from golf courses. They must have golfed in 1930, obviously.
I
guess, yeah. So data compiled from golf courses show that grass requires at least 1 inch of water weekly. Rainfall in the north central states is about 4 inches per month. Were these rains nicely spaced, little watering would be necessary. But it's usually flood or drought. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Oftentimes, that's
So
the way
true
it is.
still.
But constant vigilance is necessary to carry over dry spells.
And what kind of jumps out to me is again how relevant it is. But I'm thinking, so neither one of us were around in 1930, in 1935 when this was written. How do you suppose that they did watering of big lawns then?
Well, that's a good question.
I mean, I'm sure that there may have been, there's plumbing inside of houses, I'm sure, by then. And so there may have been
probably had a spigot right outside the house, I imagine, that they could water.
Or if they had a
and they mentioned golf courses, so they must have had irrigation.
Some kind of irrigation.
I suppose some of those, if they were located next to rivers or streams, could be irrigating out of that. But the point that I really got a kick out of it said that grass requires at least 1 inch of water weekly.
Yep.
And of course, that's a key. If we got 1 inch of rain per week, we really wouldn't have to water anything.
Yeah.
And so it's that's a current recommendation too, is that 1 inch of water per week on your lawn in one application.
Yeah.
And so the earlier quote too, that shallow sprinklings do more harm than good. So it's just fascinating that 90 years ago they were preaching that same thing. Similar to what we're doing now.
In that first little bit, we're talking about the shallow watering. Light sprinklings do more harm than good. They're about the worst treatment you can give your lawn. That's kind of dramatic. The worst treatment. I mean, would you consider that? We say it's not healthy. Would you consider it the worst treatment you could give your lawn?
I think it is.
Okay.
The reason for that is grass roots are smart. They're not going to go deep if all the water is up near the surface. So the roots are going to stay where the moisture is. And so if we're giving light, shallow sprinklings, that's where the roots are going to grow. And they're going to be addicted to that frequent light sprinklings. And then as soon as something goes wrong, heat, for example, or dryness, those roots are going to be right up in that hot zone, and they're going to be greatly affected. As opposed to if the sprinkling was less often and deeper, those roots are going to be deeper where the soil is cooler and more moist. So definitely, that is probably one of the most harmful things we could do is shallow watering on our lawn.
Yeah. Well, here's another one. This is from the book. Planting preparation is important. You may plant with poor preparation and fool yourself and your neighbors, but you can't fool the plants. I like that.
I love that. I love the last part.
Yeah, it's a little bit of kind of humor there.
An example of that, good example would be, perennials love organic matter in the soil. Peat moss, compost, perennials just love it. So I suppose when planting a perennial, you could skip that. And like it says, okay, a newly planted thing, you can fool your neighbors and yourself, but you can't fool that plant.
Yeah.
That plant knows that you didn't put enough organic matter in the soil.
Yeah, and it's gonna have an effect on that plant.
It's kind of a gem. You can't fool the plants.
Yeah, it's almost like that would be a meme now or something like that.
Boy, and I love this one. The larger the non-grass area around a new tree, the more quickly it will grow. If possible, mulch around trees with 2 inches of strawy manure.
That part stuck out at me, and I was thinking about that. I've never heard the phrase strawy manure. We know straw and we know manure, and we talk that both are beneficial to healthy gardens. But I suppose the strawy manure
out of a stable or a barn, in which straw was used for bedding.
Yep.
Then, of course, there'd be that combination of straw and manure. And one thing that I get a kick out of in the book that is changed. I suppose in the 1930s there was, I'm sure a lot of the farming was still done with horses.
Yep.
So there would have been more ready sources of manure and strawy manure. And so quite a bit in the book does mention that, more use of manure than we do now.
Yeah, exactly. They're probably not talking about bagged manure. They're talking about fresh from the horse, and then it probably was brought to you via wagon, horse-pulled wagon.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the point that I really like about that, okay, the larger the non-grass area around a tree, the more quickly it will grow. Okay, so our modern version that we've talked about is a circle of mulch, shredded bark, wood chip mulch, a circle of growth of mulch around a tree. We talked about the 5-5-5 rule.
Yep.
5 foot diameter, 5 inches thick, kept 5 inches from the trunk. So here, 90 years ago, he's indicating the importance of that non-grass area around a young tree to get the tree to grow faster. He's using straw manure. We'll use wood chips.
Yeah.
But the same idea. If you let grass encroach around a new tree, the grass robs the moisture, robs the nutrients, and the tree doesn't grow as fast from that competition.
That's really kind of a fun, and again, the different perspective that back in the 1930s, probably farms were not as far away as they are now. The access to manure and straw was probably much easier. We'll take one more here, then we'll take a break. But select only those plants which will grow well in your locality. Buy the best of them and be sure that they are hardy.
Yeah, I love that.
And now we just say plant for your zone.
Yeah, exactly. Plant for your zone. Be sure it grows well. The other part of that quote I like is buy the best of them.
Yep.
Okay, I bought an apple tree at a national chain store. It was cheap. Mm-hmm. And I've also bought apple trees at the local garden centers. 4 years later, I wish I had not bought the cheap tree.
Yeah. The
form was bad. And I would much rather have spent a few extra dollars to buy the best.
Yeah.
And so, his quote is well taken.
Yeah, it is. Again, so much of this, and again, this is probably maybe there were. When was the idea of zones? When was that incorporated?
That's a good question. Probably not until the 70s, maybe.
Yeah. So here, what he's saying is the same thing. Know your area, know what's going to grow in your area.
Yeah, I'll have to look that up, and I'll be curious. Yeah, but definitely they were not listed back at those days.
And then also the other thing that we've talked about recently is not only just when you buy plants or shrubs, things like that, not only to buy for your zone, but really for your soil too, especially with trees.
True. Exactly.
I think we were talking about that when we were talking about maple trees. That our soil may not be good for maple trees. So again,
he says select only those plants which grow well in your locality. So, like you mentioned, John, your soil type.
Yeah, know where you are, know what you have to
plant accordingly.
Offer, and plant accordingly. Well, let's take another quick break, and then we'll come back with more little bits of wisdom from this book.
When you can't make it to City Hall or school board meetings, local journalists from Inforum.com will be there to report the facts and get your questions answered. Local news works for you. Stay up to date at Inforum.com.
All right, we're back, and we're talking about this book that Don has had with him for years and years and years. It's been in his family, or copies of the book have been in the family for years. Do you think your grandparents bought it right off the shelf? I know that you said that it's been republished a number of times. So.
Yeah, and that's why I was so sad when I lost, because it had the dust cover and everything. It was tattered a bit, but it was, I could tell that they had bought it off the shelf, and they were good gardeners.
Yep.
Enjoyed vegetable gardening, flowers, and the whole works, and so I could tell that the book was well used by them. And for it to have so many reprints over the years that I know for many, many decades, probably from the 1930s until through the 50s anyway, it was the book for much of America.
Yeah, really. Really kind of really great stuff as we're talking about now. There's so much of it still holds true. And it's really kind of showing that gardening in some ways, because these plants have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. They've been, for the most part, the plants that he's talking about have been around for hundreds of years. There's been a lot of new cultivators since then. But we're not reinventing the wheel necessarily when we're talking about gardening. There may be some new tools, and there may be some new tricks, for lack of a better term, some new techniques, I should say, rather. But the basic premise is kind of the same as it's been for 100, 200 years.
Well, it is, and I just happened to turn in another page section here, and it's how to design and build a cold frame.
Yeah.
And that is right there is pictured. The cold frame that I have, I didn't get the idea from the book, but I could have. But anyway, I grow our annual plants for all our flower beds in the basement under lights. But then at a certain point in April, when my basement is full, I need more space, and to get these plants out in the sun, I built cold frames, which have a clear top, and they're wooden frames, and in which I grow them on out there from April through May. And I cover up the cold frames on chilly nights, but it gives me little kind of miniature greenhouses on the ground. But anyway, right there's the design. I could have looked in this book for it, and there it is. So, so many things that we can still use today. Oh, there's even a thing on forcing flowering branches. Did you ever try that on a forsythia or any of the, or pussy willow?
No.
Forcing a pussy willow branch. Well, here it is, describes the method in late winter, cutting off a branch, putting it in water, and getting it to flower. So you have so lots of good stuff in here.
Well, let's get back to some of the other little bits that we've kind of singled out that you've singled out rather as really some kind of timeless little gems to keep in mind.
Sure. One of those is pinch back the tops of perennials as they grow to produce compact plants. In dry spells, water them thoroughly rather than often.
That one is kind of that's an interesting one, because a pinching back, I'm familiar with doing that with my annuals, especially like coleus, something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Where you want big bushy, shrubby, or not shrubby, but big bushy ones.
Yeah, because for example, in a coleus, like you mentioned, if you pinch back that central growing point where there was one growing point, two develop at that point.
Or basil is another one that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So pinching those, many zinnias and all kinds of annuals will become bushier. So yeah, we're probably less familiar with pinching back perennials.
Yeah.
But the next part of that quote would be perennials that benefit most from that.
Yeah.
Okay, now a peony, when that starts, or an iris, when those start, there's nothing there to really pinch back.
Yeah.
But if it's a perennial that has kind of branching, for example, perennial mums. By the way, I'm trying a new one called Igloo. Perennial mum that's supposed to be more winter hardy.
Okay.
Garden mums that you plant out, grow them all in your perennial flower garden, and they bloom beautiful in the fall. And so anyway, mums is a classic one, the garden mums, that as they're growing, if you pinch out those central growing points, they become bushier, more branches, and etc. So if it's the type of perennial that has kind of a branched stem, you can pinch that back. And of course, there's the second part of it is very important too. In dry spells, water thoroughly rather than often. So give it a good soaking, once a week. So even in a drought, soak it down good once a week, and rather than those quick little sprinkles.
Would you recommend that too for annuals? Because we talk about certain annuals like petunias are really heavy feeders. And again, I guess maybe what they're planted in may not be so deep where you don't have to worry about a big thorough, as opposed to something that's planted in the ground where you would really want a deep watering. But should we with something like a petunia or something like that? Would you want rather the frequent and the steady lighter waterings, or would you want longer but less frequent deeper waterings?
Both.
Okay.
And here's what I mean by that, John.
Yeah.
When you first plant annual flowers, they don't have much of a root system. So until they root down, it's kind of important to maybe water them more often so that little shallow root system that they have will start to develop. So at first, a person needs to water maybe more often. For example, when I plant a new flower bed, I have to kind of watch to make sure that, because I know those roots are still not very deep, I need to make sure it has water, maybe a little more often. But then you start tapering off as that plant grows, and they root farther down. So after the first couple of weeks, then go to the once a week deep watering. So about the only time, there's only a couple of cases to water more frequently. One is newly planted annuals that you kind of know they aren't deeply rooted, so you got to kind of nurse them along a little. That's maybe a way to talk about it. And the second issue is newly germinating or planted grass seed.
Okay.
That has to be kept shallowly watered so that newly emerging grass seed has sufficient moisture. And then after the grass stand is good, then the less frequent watering.
All right. Here's another one from the book. No matter how varied an assortment modern food markets can offer nowadays, and no matter how high the quality of frozen foods that are becoming increasingly available, a garden can supply us with fresher vegetables than we can buy. Well, certainly that's true.
Yeah,
we don't need to debate whether that has has held up. But again, I love the verbiage. I love the way of writing that.
The quality of frozen foods that are becoming increasingly available.
Yeah.
I suppose in the 1930s, maybe the home freezer probably wasn't common, I suppose.
No, and I mean, I think I remember, I remember hearing from my parents it was still more canned foods than frozen foods.
Exactly.
Especially when it comes to vegetables.
Oh, yeah, because my grandparents even canned meat.
Yeah.
Because we freeze all of our meat. So it's interesting. So I suppose the home freezer and even in stores, I suppose they maybe didn't have that big of assortment of frozen foods.
No, it's just that's a kind of a neat little throwback, and that's a very visual one that you can kind of you can think of, that it puts a picture in your mind of the kind of the old vintage grocery stores like around here. The only one that I remember was Leiby's, which was kind of.
Is that on Broadway?
Yeah, it was on Broadway.
Yeah.
It was in the old what is now Zambros.
Right.
And where it was probably one of the last neighborhood grocery stores, and at a time when there would be a grocery store probably every 5 to 10 blocks. That in your neighborhood you had your place that you could walk to and pick up stuff for meal and bring it back. But it's just kind of it's an interesting look back on those.
It is. It's fun that many people are discovering home vegetable gardening again.
Yeah.
And the pandemic, of course, that really brought it on again. So it's really fun that people are once again discovering, as they did 90 years ago, that it's tough to beat that fresh tomato.
Yeah. Well, and the taste is one thing, but then also there's and I'm not sure how you categorize this, just the feeling of knowing that you've grown something, or that where it came from. It's a nice feeling. It's a good feeling. It is,
and it's so handy to go out your back door. For example, tonight we're going to have potatoes. I haven't dug our potatoes yet, but for supper tonight I'm going to go dig a hill of potatoes.
Yeah.
It's handy.
That'll be good.
And healthy.
Yes, exactly. You know where it's been.
Yeah, I do. We do.
Speaking of food from the garden, here's another good one if you want to read that one.
Oh, yeah, I love this one, boy. And many of our apples are still on the tree, the late apples such as Haralson that like some cooler fall temperatures because it does favor the accumulation of sugars. But it's very important to know how to pick an apple off of a tree, because if a person just yanks on it, and I'll get to the quote in a minute, if a person just yanks on that, you can pull off the little twig on which that apple's attached. Okay, the apple has a stem, but the stem is attached to a twig. And if you yank on that whole thing, it can pull off a little section of twig that maybe doesn't seem that dramatic, but that little section of twig is where next year's flower buds are located. So you can be pulling off next year's flower buds if a person isn't careful.
You can really damage the tree that way.
Yeah, you could ruin next year's, if you did that to many apples and pulled off chunks of twig, you could eliminate next year's fruit crop.
Yeah.
Because you're pulling off next year's flower buds that are already formed. So here's the quote. Apples should never be pulled off the tree so as to break the twig. Instead, hold the specimen in the palm of the hand, the stem firmly between fingers and thumb, and give a twist. If it's ripe, the stem will separate from the twig without damage to either the twig or the apple.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good description. It even tells where the stem, located between the finger and thumb. And, I might add, too, in that description, the twist. But if you grab the apple and along with twist, kind of rotate the apple upward.
Okay.
And it comes off very nicely.
Yeah. It's a neat little kind of visual way of thinking about how to do that.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
a really good. And yeah, again, this being apple season, it seems really, really timely, as does this one. For perennials, the general rule is to transplant them in the spring or early fall, whichever is farthest away from their season of bloom. And we've been talking about that.
I love that quote because oftentimes a person wonders, us gardeners wonders, okay, what again is the best time to dig and divide, like hosta and some of those? But here it is, and it's the same rule of thumb that we've repeated and that is very much as true today, and that is just choose the season opposite the bloom time, as it says. Transplant them in spring or early fall, whichever is farthest from the season of bloom, because that season of bloom is when any plant is at its most tender. It's expended a lot of energy to put out that nice bloom, and if we start monkeying around with the roots and digging, dividing, it's going to be tough on that plant. But the farthest away from that bloom is when the plant isn't so sensitive, and so it will transplant or divide with much better success. So I love that. Again, peonies haven't changed in the last 100 years, and so here's the rule of thumb that was as good then as it is now.
Yep, exactly. Irises, same thing. Iris would be we're coming up on the end of the window to probably transplant irises, but that would be another one to do that you'd want to do so that in spring it's set in its new place and it's ready to grow and bloom.
And so what I love about discussions like this and kind of reviewing the book, what I love about this is it lets us gardeners know that we're part of an ongoing body of information. You're part of you're really part of a gardening legacy, aren't you, when you put into practice these things? It's not, every generation isn't a brand new thing. You carry forth this body of information. And so I just think it's kind of neat. Gardeners are really part of just an ongoing generation to generation passing along the information. And some of the things that you don't maybe learn about or hear about, you stumble upon yourself. Like the way he says that it's, you stumble your way out of some of these predicaments. Yep. You plant things too close, and so then you stumble out of it. And when you replant, then you don't make the same mistake. And so it's just kind of fun to be part of that whole collection, that collaboration of generation to generation of gardeners.
It is great. It's a great thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Thank you very much for bringing this book in today. It's been fun to go through this.
Yeah, it has. And it is. I just really treasure that book. And anytime we read something nationally, and of course this book is the same, it was a national book, that we do need to check on things to make sure they apply. One thing I notice is in this book, which is a common national thing, is it recommends lime. It does say, make sure you check your local area. But, lime in our area isn't recommended. So there are some things, even in this book, that a person has to tailor to our own growing area. But generally, the wisdom and the kind of quaint language. So if anyone's looking for it and is in the mood for an old gardening book, I did see a number of copies on eBay, and they weren't terribly, it wasn't like trying to get the Gutenberg Bible or something. Right. So it was,
you won't have to take out a loan for it.
No. So again, it was the complete book of garden magic. So if you're in the mood for kind of an old treasure book that makes a fun reference book, that's the one.
That's really great. And it's great that you have this family connection to that book.
Yeah, that was awesome. It was, because again, they didn't have many books in their house, but this was their gardening book. And apparently for quite a few decades, that was the book to have in America for gardening.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for another episode of Growing Together. Don, if people have questions for you about their own legacy gardening or any other questions they have, what's the best way to reach you?
Best way is to give me an email at donald.kinzler, I'll spell that, Kinzler, donald.kinzler at ndsu.edu.
All right, and we'll talk to you next week.
Yeah, that'll be great. And thanks again, everyone, for listening.